Captain Ansel Voro did not believe in ghost stories, but the sensor readings in front of her looked like one anyway. Her ship, the Quiet Current, was a small Vakari survey vessel, built for mapping dead systems and cataloging ruins. The Vakari were traders and explorers, not soldiers. They liked old things because old things could be sold, studied, or simply admired. For 3 years, the Quiet Current had drifted through the outer rim of what used to be called human space, poking through empty stations and burned-out colonies, looking for anything worth taking home. Sol System was the biggest prize of all. It had been empty for almost 60 years. No signals, no traffic, no survivors that anyone had ever found. Humanity had simply gone quiet, the way a room goes quiet when everyone inside it has died, or left without a word. Other species called it the silence. Nobody knew exactly what had happened, only that it had happened fast, and that whatever had done it had never been seen again. Ansel had expected an empty solar system with a dead blue-green planet at its center. She had not expected this. "Run it again," she said. Her navigator, a young Vakari named Ithran, was already running it again. His 4 eyes moved rapidly over the display, and his voice came out thinner than usual. "Same result, Captain. Beyond the moon of the 3rd planet. Big metal shapes. Hundreds of them. Maybe more than 1,000. "Ships?" "Ships," Ithran said. "Warships, by the shape of them. Old human warships, from the look of the hull design. But Captain, they're arranged, not scattered. Arranged in formation, like they're still on duty." Ansel leaned over the console and looked for herself. The image resolved slowly as the Quiet Current's long-range sensors sharpened their focus. What she saw made the fur along her spine rise. Rows and rows of massive hulls floated in the dark beyond the pale gray moon. They were arranged in wide rings, one inside another, like the layers of an old wooden shield. In the center of the rings sat something larger than all the rest. A ship so big, it looked less like a vessel and more like a small dead world of its own. Every hull she could see had its nose pointed outward, away from the planet, away from the sun, out toward open space. Not one of them faced inward. Not one of them faced home. "They're all facing the same direction," Ansel said quietly. "Yes, Captain. Toward nothing. Toward empty space." Ithran didn't answer right away. He was still counting hulls. 1106, he said finally. "That I can see. There could be more behind the first rings. The formation is too wide for full scan from here." 1,100 warships. Ansel had grown up hearing that humanity's last fleet had been destroyed in the final years of the silence, burned away trying to defend a homeworld that fell anyway. Every historian she had ever read agreed on that point. The human navy was gone. It had died fighting, and it had lost, and that was the end of the story. But stories were not always true, and dead things did not usually sit in perfect formation for 60 years. "Life signs?" she asked. "None," Ithran said. "No heat, no power, no drive signatures. They read as completely dead, Captain. Cold metal, nothing else." "Then why are they still in formation?" "A dead fleet drifts apart. Gravity pulls it in 100 directions over 60 years. This didn't drift. This was built to stay exactly where it is." Ithran's ears folded back, a Vakari sign of unease. Maybe they're on some kind of automatic station keeping. Old system, still running on its own power, keeping the ships in place even with nobody aboard. "Maybe," Ansel said. She did not believe it, but she couldn't offer a better answer yet. She thought about turning around. That was the safe choice, and safety was usually the smart choice out here at the edge of dead human space. But the Quiet Current had not traveled 3 years, and crossed half the old human frontier to turn back from the biggest discovery any Vakari survey ship had ever made. If even one of those hulls held working technology, it would be worth more than everything else her crew had found combined. And if the fleet truly was empty, truly abandoned, then there was no danger in looking. "Bring us closer," she said. "Slow approach. Keep shields up and weapons cold. I want eyes on this before we decide anything." The Quiet Current eased forward through the dark. As they closed the distance, more details came into focus. The warships were enormous, by any standard Ansel had seen, human or otherwise. The smallest of them, out on the edges of the formation, were still 3 times the size of her own survey ship. The ones deeper in the rings dwarfed even that, and the giant one at the center, the one that looked like a dead moon, was so large that her ship's sensors struggled to measure it in a single sweep. "That center ship," Ithrin said. "I'm reading a designation on the hull. Faint, but there. It says," he paused, running the translation twice to be sure. "It says, last word." "Last word," Ansel repeated. "As in, the last thing said before the end. Or the last thing said before someone else begins," Ithrin offered. Ansel didn't answer that. She kept watching the screen as the ships grew larger and larger, filling more and more of the display, until it felt less like looking at a fleet and more like flying into the ribs of some enormous dead animal. Up close, the ships did not look damaged. That was the strangest part. A war fleet that fought and lost should show scars, burn marks, broken hulls, the wreckage of battle. These ships looked untouched, as if they had been parked here on a quiet afternoon and simply never moved again. Paint markings were faded, but still legible. Hull plating showed the wear of decades of exposure to space, but no wear of combat. "They weren't destroyed," Ansel said slowly. "Nobody beat this fleet. They just stopped." "Or they were told to stop," Ithrin said. That idea sat uncomfortably in Ansel's chest. A fleet this size did not simply choose to stop fighting a war it was losing. Not unless something changed. Not unless someone with the authority to give that order believed there was a better use for 1,100 warships than dying in one last battle. She ordered the ship to slow further as they entered the outer ring of the formation. Now she could see the individual hulls clearly through the viewport, gray and silent, running lights long dead, hatches sealed, weapon ports closed. Some of the ships had strange markings near their bows, symbols that Ithrin's translation matrix struggled to parse. Numbers mostly. Fleet designations. A few had names stenciled in human script. Vigilant Watch. Last Stand. No Surrender. Long Wait. "They're not just ship names," Ansel murmured, reading them one after another. "They're a message." She picked the nearest hull for a closer look, a mid-sized warship called Long Wait, and brought the quiet current alongside it, close enough that the shadow of the massive dead ship swallowed her own vessel completely. Up close, the scale of it was dizzying. Weapon emplacements the size of small buildings lined the hull in neat rows, armor plating thick enough to stop anything Ansel's sensors could identify. "Captain," Ithrin said, his voice suddenly tight, "I'm picking up something. A very faint power signature, deep inside the hull. It wasn't there a moment ago, or it was too weak to register until we got this close." Ansel's pulse quickened. "Weapon status?" "No change. No targeting activity. It's not aiming at us. It's just on, like something small woke up because we got close." "Could be automated defense coming online," Ansel said. "Could be nothing. An old system flickering because our engines disturbed it." She didn't fully believe that either, but she needed to say something steady out loud, if only for her own nerves. "Hold position. Don't get any closer until we understand what that signature is." They sat there in the shadow of the dead warship, engines idling, sensors straining to make sense of the faint pulse of power buried somewhere deep in its hull. "Captain," Ithrin said after a long silence, "there's something else. I almost missed it under the power signature. There's a transmission, very old, very weak, on a loop. It's been playing the whole time we've been sitting here. I think it's been playing for years." "Play it." The voice that came through the speakers was human, male, tired in a way that went beyond simple exhaustion. It was the voice of someone who had said the same words so many times that the words themselves had worn smooth, like a stone polished by a river. "This is Fleet Command, Seoul Defense Authority, broadcasting on automated repeat. If you are reading this and you are not human, please listen carefully before you touch anything. This fleet is not dead. It is asleep. It was put to sleep on purpose, by us, because we could not win the war we were fighting, and we were not willing to lose everything trying. We built this fleet for one reason only, not to defend a planet, not to win territory. We built it to fight one enemy, the only enemy that ever truly frightened us, the one we called the Threshold. If that enemy has come back, and you are near this fleet, you are in more danger than you understand. Leave, now. If the Threshold has not come back, then these ships will sleep until it does, however long that takes. We are not gone. We are waiting. Every ship in this fleet is waiting for the same enemy. God help whoever wakes them up early. The recording ended and looped back to its beginning. The same tired voice, starting the same warning over again. Nobody on the bridge of the quiet current spoke for a long moment. The threshold, Ithrin finally said. I've never heard that name before. Not in any record. Neither have I, Ansel said. Her mouth had gone dry. She had come here hoping to find salvage. Instead, she had found a warning, left by a species that everyone believed was extinct, aimed at whatever eventually found their graveyard. Except this wasn't a graveyard. The recording made that painfully clear. This was a trap set for the future. A fleet held in careful, deliberate sleep, waiting for an enemy so dangerous that the entire human race had chosen to disappear, rather than keep fighting it in the open. And the recording had said the fleet was not dead. Asleep. Which meant, somewhere inside those 1,100 silent hulls, something might still be able to wake up. Captain, Ithrin said quietly. What do we do? Ansel stared at the message log, replaying in her mind the phrase that would not leave her alone. Every ship in this fleet is waiting for the same enemy. She thought about turning the quiet current around, filing a report, letting some larger, better-armed fleet come investigate a discovery this dangerous. That was the responsible choice. It was probably the only sane choice. But there was another thought sitting underneath the fear, quieter and harder to ignore. If humanity had built this fleet, hidden this fleet, and left this warning specifically for whoever found it, then someone out there had believed the threshold would return. And if it hadn't returned yet, after 60 years, that didn't mean it never would. We're not leaving yet, Ansel said. Not until we understand what we're looking at. Ithrin, pull every scrap of data you can on this fleet, without waking anything up. I want to know who built it, why, and what in the stars this threshold actually is. And if we wake something up by accident? Ansel looked out at the endless silent rows of gray hulls stretching away into the dark, ship after ship after ship, all of them facing the same direction, all of them waiting for the same enemy, all of them holding their breath for 60 long years. Then we'll find out exactly what humanity was so afraid of, she said. And we'll find out if they were right to be. The quiet current held its position in the shadow of the sleeping fleet, small and fragile against the enormous silent hulls, while far above them, deep inside the ship called Last Word, a single indicator light flickered on in the darkness and stayed lit. Ansel Voro spent the next 2 days doing the one thing every good captain learns to do before taking a risk, gathering every piece of information she could find, so that whatever mistake she made would at least be an informed one. The quiet current kept its distance from the fleet, sitting far enough back that its engines would not disturb any more hidden systems, but close enough to keep scanning. Ithrin worked almost without sleep, pulling old records from the ship's archive, cross-referencing anything the Vicari had ever recorded about the final years of human civilization. Most of it was second-hand, traders' rumors, fragments of human broadcasts intercepted decades ago and never fully translated, reports from other species who had passed through Sol's system after the silence and found nothing but wreckage and quiet. None of it mentioned a fleet like this. None of it mentioned anything called the threshold. That's what worries me, Ithrin said, rubbing his eyes with 2 of his 4 hands. If this enemy was big enough to make humanity build 1,100 warships and hide them for 60 years, somebody else should have heard of it. Some record should exist, but there's nothing. It's like they erased every mention of it except this one recording. Maybe they did erase it, Ansel said, on purpose. She had been turning the same thought over for 2 days. If the threshold was dangerous enough that even mentioning its name might draw its attention, then hiding all knowledge of it, everywhere, would be exactly what a desperate species might try. It was a strange kind of caution, reckless in its own way, because it meant nobody else in the galaxy would recognize the danger coming until it was already at their door. But also careful, because it meant nobody would go looking for trouble that wasn't theirs to find. I want to get inside one of the smaller ships, Ansel said. Not the center one, not yet. One of the outer hulls, something small enough that if it does wake up, we can get clear before anything serious happens. Ithrin didn't look thrilled by the idea, but he didn't argue either. He had been part of Ansel's crew long enough to know that once she decided something was worth the risk, arguing only slowed down the inevitable. They chose a ship near the outer edge of the formation, one of the smaller hulls, still enormous compared to the quiet current. but modest next to the giants closer to the center. Its hull markings read, "The Silent Hour." Sensors showed the same faint, low-power signature they had detected before, the barest flicker of something alive deep inside cold metal, but no active systems, no defensive response, nothing that suggested the ship even knew they were there. Ansel took a small boarding team, herself, Ithrin, and two of her most experienced crew, a heavy-set engineer named Doran, and a quiet security officer named Kess. They suited up, checked their equipment twice, and crossed the gap between the two ships in a small shuttle, watching the enormous gray hull of the Silent Hour swallow their entire field of view as they approached. Getting inside was easier than Ansel expected. The outer airlock had no power, but it had a manual release, a simple mechanical lever meant for exactly this kind of emergency entry. Whoever designed these ships had planned for the possibility that someone, someday, would need to get in without any working systems at all. "That's not the behavior of a ship meant to stay hidden forever," Doran said as he worked the release. They wanted it findable, just not easy. The airlock cycled manually, slow and creaking, and they stepped into darkness. Their suit lights cut narrow beams through corridors that had not seen light in 60 years. The air inside was thin but breathable, still holding a trace of pressure from whatever life support systems had once run here. Dust hung motionless in the beams of their lights, disturbed for the first time in decades by the simple act of their footsteps. The ship was silent, in a way that felt heavier than ordinary silence. Ansel had explored dead ships before, drifting hulks with no power, and no hope of anyone ever coming back to them. This felt different. Every hallway they passed through looked maintained, not decayed. Panels were closed. Equipment was secured. There was no sign of panic, no scattered debris, no evidence of a crew that had died in fear or confusion. It looked like a ship that had been shut down carefully, deliberately, by people who knew exactly what they were doing and intended to come back to it. "This way," Ithrin said, checking a handheld scanner. "Power signatures coming from somewhere near the center of the ship. Looks like some kind of core system." They moved deeper, past rows of sealed cabins that Ansel guessed had once housed a crew, past a mess hall with tables still bolted in neat rows, past a section of wall covered in small metal plaques, each one engraved with a name. Kess paused at the wall of names, running a light over them. "Memorial," she said quietly. "This is a memorial wall." Ansel stepped closer and read a few of the names herself, though they meant nothing to her personally. Human names, human dates, all clustered within the same few final years. Whatever this ship had been through before it went silent, it had lost people, and someone had taken the time to remember them properly before shutting the whole ship down. They knew this might be the end, Ansel said, and they still took the time to do this. To remember who they'd lost, before they went to sleep not knowing if they'd ever wake up again. Nobody said anything to that. They moved on. The core system, when they found it, was smaller than Ansel expected. A single sealed room near the heart of the ship, lit by one dim indicator light glowing steady green in the dark. A console sat beneath it, dust-covered but intact, and a single word was stenciled on the wall above it in faded human script. "Watchman. Careful," Ansel said, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was warning against. "Doran, can you get a read on this without touching anything active?" Doran ran his scanner slowly over the console, frowning behind his visor. "It's not fully dead," he said. "There's a very low-power system running. Not doing much. Just watching maybe. Monitoring. Like a single eye that never closes. Can you tell what it's watching for?" Doran shook his head, not without waking it up more than it already is. "But look at this." He pointed to a section of the console where a small screen, barely lit, displayed a scrolling line of text, repeating over and over, in a loop, too faint to have been visible from across the room. Ansel leaned in close to read it. "Threat signature. Not detected. Standby maintained." Over and over, the same two lines, endlessly repeating, endlessly checking, endlessly finding nothing, and continuing to wait anyway. "It's been doing this for 60 years, Ithrin said, something like awe creeping into his voice. "Just sitting here, checking, over and over, never getting an answer, and never giving up." Ansel felt something she hadn't expected to feel, standing in a dead human warship. Respect. Whatever fear had driven humanity to build this fleet and hide it away, they had not simply abandoned the project and walked away. They had left something behind to keep watching, patient and tireless, for as long as it took. That was not the behavior of a species that had given up. That was the behavior of a species preparing very carefully for a fight it expected to have again someday. "I want to know more about the threshold," Ansel said. "There has to be more information somewhere on this ship. Logs, records, anything." They found what they were looking for in a small room adjoining the core chamber, a records archive with a manual data terminal, powered by the same faint trickle of energy keeping the Watchman system alive. Doran managed to coax the terminal into life, without disturbing anything else, and after several tense minutes of careful work, a screen flickered on, offering a simple menu of archived files. Ansel selected the oldest one. The recording that played was different from the warning message they had heard before. This one was a briefing, formal and clinical, delivered by a woman in a military uniform, her voice steady, despite the exhaustion clearly written across her face. "For the record, 3 years ago, long-range monitoring stations at the edge of our territory detected an object entering our systems from outside known space. It did not respond to any communication. It did not slow down. Within 6 months, it had destroyed 4 outposts, and everyone on them. Within a year, we understood we were not dealing with a single ship, or even a single fleet. We were dealing with something that grew as it moved, that consumed material and turned it into more of itself, that spread the way a disease spreads through a body. We called it the threshold, because every world it reached became the edge, the last known point before an unknown darkness. Conventional warfare failed against it almost immediately. Weapons that worked on any other enemy did almost nothing to it. It did not seem to fight for territory or resources in any way we understood. It simply expanded, and everything in its path was consumed or destroyed." The recording paused, and the woman on screen looked down for a moment before continuing. "We lost 11 core systems trying to fight it head-on before High Command accepted the truth. We could not win this war with the fleet we had. So we built a different fleet. Every ship in what would become the Sol Defense Authority Final Armada was designed around one goal: survive contact with the threshold long enough to strike its actual weak points, which our researchers eventually identified after years of costly, bloody study. Those weaknesses are recorded separately, under the highest classification this command has ever used, because if the threshold ever intercepts this information, it will adapt, the way it always adapts. We are not building this fleet to save the systems we've already lost. We are building it to make sure that if the threshold ever comes looking for what remains of us, it finds an enemy it cannot simply consume." The recording ended. Ansel stood very still in the dim light of the archive room, absorbing what she had just heard. "They didn't lose the war because they were weak," she said slowly. "They lost because they were fighting the wrong way. And then they changed everything, and hid the new fleet, and waited. For 60 years, Ithran said. "For as long as it takes," Ansel corrected. "That's what the Watchman system said. Standby maintained. They didn't put a time limit on this. They built something that could wait forever if it had to, and just kept checking, every single day, for a threat that never came back." Kess, who had been quiet through most of the exploration, finally spoke. "Until now, maybe. Captain, our engines, our sensor sweeps. We've been sitting near this fleet for 2 days, running active scans, generating more power output than this ship has probably registered in decades. What if we're the reason that indicator light came on in the first place? What if something in that Watchman system read us as unusual activity and started paying closer attention?" Ansel felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. She looked back at the small green light glowing steadily above the console, the single patient eye that had been checking, over and over, for 60 years, for any sign that its enemy had returned. "We need to be very careful," she said, "about what we do next. Because if that system starts thinking we might be connected to the thing it's been waiting for, I don't think it's going to ask us politely to explain ourselves." They left the archive room and made their way back through the silent corridors, past the memorial wall, past the sealed cabins, back toward the airlock and the darkness outside. Behind them, in the small chamber at the heart of the silent hour. The Watchman system continued its endless quiet vigil, the same 2 lines scrolling across its dim screen, over and over. unbothered by the visitors who had come and gone. Threat signature, not detected, standby maintained. But as the shuttle carrying Ansel and her crew pulled away from the silent hour and drifted back toward the quiet current, deep in the sensor array of the great ship, last word. At the very center of the sleeping fleet, something changed. A single new line appeared beneath the old ones, faint at first, then steady, then unmistakable. Anomaly detected, Sector 7, external source, not prior threat signature, logging. The fleet had not woken, not yet, but for the first time in 60 years, it had noticed something new, and somewhere deep inside its long-dormant systems, a slow and careful process of paying attention had quietly begun. Ansel had no way of knowing any of this as her shuttle crossed the dark gap between ships. She only knew, watching the vast silent hulls slide past her viewport, row after row after row, that she and her crew had stumbled into something far bigger than a simple salvage run. They had found the last, best effort of a species everyone believed was gone, a fleet built not out of hope, but out of grim, careful preparation for a horror the rest of the galaxy had never even heard of. And somewhere out past the edge of known space, unseen and unhurried, that horror was still out there. The only question left was how much longer it would stay that way. 3 weeks passed before anything changed. Ansel had used the time carefully. She sent a full report back toward Vakari space, describing the fleet, the recordings, the warning about the threshold, and her recommendation that no one approach the system without extreme caution. She did not expect a quick response. Messages took months to cross that much distance, even at the fastest relay speeds her people had. Whatever help or guidance came back would arrive long after whatever happened next had already happened. In the meantime, she kept the quiet current at a respectful distance from the fleet, monitoring, waiting, trying to decide whether the responsible thing to do was leave entirely or stay and watch in case something worse was coming. It was Ithrin who noticed the change first, in the deep hours of the ship's night cycle, when most of the crew was asleep, and only a skeleton watch monitored the sensors. "Captain." His voice over the comm was tight, urgent, in a way that pulled Ansel out of her bunk before she was even fully awake. "Captain, you need to see this." She reached the bridge in under 2 minutes, still pulling on her jacket. Ithrin was hunched over the main display, 4 eyes locked on a reading that made no sense to her at first glance. "Talk to me," she said. "Long-range sensors picked up something entering the outer edge of the system about 10 minutes ago," Ithrin said. "At first I thought it was a sensor error. Then I thought it might be debris, or a rogue asteroid, something natural. It's not natural, Captain. It's moving with purpose, and it's growing. Growing how?" Ithrin pulled up the sensor data and let it play across the main screen. What Ansel saw looked, at first, like a small dark smear against the starfield, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. But as the recording advanced through the 10 minutes of data, the smear expanded, spreading outward in slow, deliberate patterns, consuming small pockets of debris and dust that drifted near it, folding that material into itself and growing larger with every passing minute. "That's not a fleet," Ansel said slowly. "That's not ships in formation. That's one thing. Growing. I cross-referenced the movement pattern and the growth behavior against everything we recorded from the human archive," Ithrin said. "Captain, it matches. It matches almost exactly what that briefing officer described. Consuming material, expanding into anything nearby, moving with intent but with no communication, no response to hails, nothing." Ansel's mouth had gone dry. "The threshold." "I can't confirm that with certainty," Ithrin said, "but I don't have a better explanation. And Captain, there's something else. The fleet noticed it before we did." He switched the display, and Ansel watched as new data streamed in, from the direction of the sleeping fleet beyond the moon. What had been 1,100 cold, dark hulls for 3 weeks was no longer entirely cold or entirely dark. Small pinpricks of light were flickering to life across the formation, ship after ship, slow at first, then faster, spreading outward from the great central vessel, like a wave rolling through the rings. "They're waking up," Ansel breathed. "The Watchman systems," Ithrin said. "They must be networked, ship to ship, all reporting back to that central hull. Something out there matched the threat signature they'd been watching for, and now the whole fleet is responding. Ansel felt her heart pounding as she watched hull after hull light up on the display, running lights flickering on, weapon systems that had been sealed for 60 years, slowly grinding through startup sequences, never meant to be interrupted. This was not the cautious, curious exploration of the last 3 weeks. This was something else entirely. An enormous machine built for exactly one purpose, finally beginning to do the thing it had been built to do. "We need to leave," Kess said, arriving on the bridge still half-dressed from being woken by the alert. "Captain, whatever that thing out there is, and whatever this fleet is about to become, neither one of those things is safe for us to be near." Ansel wanted to agree. Every instinct told her to turn the quiet current around and put as much distance as possible between her small ship and whatever was about to happen in this system. But something else held her in place, a stubborn curiosity that had gotten her into trouble more than once in her career, and a growing sense that she was about to witness something that had never been witnessed before by anyone outside humanity itself. "Give me 5 more minutes," she said. "I want to see what happens when that central ship wakes up fully. Then we leave, whatever we see." The 5 minutes stretched into something closer to 20, because none of them could look away. The great ship. Last word. Silent for 60 years at the heart of the sleeping fleet, began to change in ways that were difficult to fully track, even with their sensors working at full capacity. Systems that had shown no power signature at all suddenly blazed to life, section by section, until the entire enormous hull was lit from within, running lights tracing patterns along its surface that looked almost like a living thing taking its first breath after a very long sleep. Then, from somewhere deep inside that vast hull, a new transmission began, broadcasting on every frequency the quiet current systems could detect. "This is Fleet Command Authority Watchman Network, activating under emergency protocol threshold confirmed. All standby personnel, report to designated stations. All automated systems, proceed to full readiness. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. The enemy has returned." "Personnel," Ithran said, his voice hushed. "Captain, it said personnel. It's calling for people to report to stations. There shouldn't be anyone left alive on those ships. It's been 60 years. Ansel didn't have an answer for that, but she was about to get one. New readings began appearing across her display, small pockets of biological activity flickering to life deep within the central ship, readings that had shown nothing but cold metal for the entire 3 weeks they had been watching. Life signs, human life signs, spread across dozens of locations throughout the last word. Each one slowly warming from something that had clearly been a state of deep, sustained hibernation. "They kept people alive," Kess said, disbelief plain in her voice. "The whole time, in stasis, waiting, just like the ships were waiting." Ansel thought back to the recording from the silent hour. The tired voice of the woman explaining what the threshold was, and why humanity had built this fleet to fight it a second time. She had assumed, listening to that recording, that whoever made it was long dead, that the fleet was a monument built by people who never expected to see it used. But if there were people alive on that central ship right now, waking up after 60 years of sleep to answer a call they must have known might never come, then this was not a monument at all. It was a promise, kept. "Captain," Ithran said, "the growing object, the one we think is the threshold, it's changed course. It was moving in a general direction before, expanding as it went, but now it's turning, toward the fleet. It knows they're awake," Ansel said. "Or it's always known they were here, and it was simply waiting for the right moment," Ithran said. "Either way, it's coming this direction now, and its rate of approach is increasing." Ansel forced herself to think clearly, despite the fear tightening in her chest. She had a small survey ship with no meaningful weapons, sitting in the middle of what was about to become a battlefield between a fleet of 1,100 warships and an enemy that had once brought an entire species to the edge of extinction. Every rational instinct told her to run, and run now, while there was still time and open space to do it in. But the quiet current had sensors that were sharper than most warships carried, built for careful survey work rather than combat, and Ansel realized with a strange mixture of fear and fascination, that she might be about to record the only outside account of this battle that would ever exist. If the fleet lost, if the threshold consumed everything here the way it had consumed so much before, there might be no one else left to tell the galaxy what had happened, or to warn whoever came next. "We're not running yet," she said. "We're moving to a safer distance, but we're staying in sensor range. I want everything we can capture, logged and ready to transmit the moment we're clear, in case we don't get a second chance to send it." Kess looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. She had served with Ansel long enough to know when a decision had already been made. As the quiet current pulled back to a more cautious distance, more transmissions began pouring out from the awakening fleet, no longer just the automated Watchman broadcast, but real voices now, human voices, some groggy with sleep, some sharp and alert, calling out status reports and readiness checks across dozens of channels. "Last word actual, this is Bravo Squadron, all hands accounted for, weapons coming online. Fleet Command, this is Silent Hour, minimal crew but operational, standing by. This is Colonel Mara Chen, Senior Surviving Officer, last word, requesting full status report from all squadrons. If anyone out there can hear this, and you're not one of ours, get clear of this system. We don't know how much room we're going to need." Ansel listened to that last transmission twice, something in the woman's voice striking her deeply. There was no panic in it, despite 60 years of sleep, and an enemy already bearing down on them. There was only steady, practiced calm, the voice of someone who had trained for exactly this moment, for longer than Ansel had been alive, and who intended to do the job she had been asked to do. "Send a response," Ansel told Ithrin. "Tell them who we are. Tell them we're a survey vessel, not a threat, and tell them we're pulling back to observation range. And Ithrin, ask if there's anything we can do to help." Ithrin looked at her with something between disbelief and respect. "Captain, we have no weapons worth mentioning. We have sensors better than most of their ships probably carry after 60 years of neglect," Ansel said. "If nothing else, we can be their eyes on something they can't see themselves. Send the message." The response came back faster than Ansel expected. The same steady voice from before, Colonel Chen, now sounding slightly less surprised and slightly more focused. "Quiet current, this is Chen. Appreciated, but keep well clear of the engagement zone regardless. If you're willing to share sensor data on the enemy's approach vector and growth rate, patch it through on this frequency. We'll take whatever help we can get. And Captain, thank you for staying instead of running. Not everyone would." Ansel felt something tighten in her throat at those words. She had spent 3 years cataloging the remains of a species everyone assumed was extinct, treating their ruins as curiosities, and their history as a puzzle to be solved from a safe distance. Now, for the first time, she was talking directly to a human being, a soldier who had slept for 60 years, waiting for exactly this moment, and that soldier was thanking her for simply choosing not to abandon them. "Patch the data through," Ansel said quietly. "All of it, everything we've got." Outside, in the growing dark, the fleet finished waking, hull after hull coming fully online, weapon systems charging, engines flaring to life after decades of silence. And beyond them, still distant but closing steadily, the dark and growing mass of the threshold continued its slow, relentless approach, exactly as it had approached everything else in its path, for as long as anyone could remember. The waiting was over. After 60 years of silence, the same enemy that had once driven humanity to the edge of extinction was coming back, and this time, humanity was not going to meet it unprepared. Ansel Voro sat on the bridge of her small survey ship, sensors locked on the approaching darkness, and understood, with sudden and complete certainty, that she was about to watch the last, best hope of an entire species find out whether 60 years of careful, patient preparation had been enough. The threshold entered visual range 6 hours later, and by then, Ansel understood why humanity had once been so afraid of it. It did not look like a fleet, or a single massive ship, or anything that fit neatly into the categories she was used to thinking in. It looked like a wound in space, a dark, uneven mass that seemed to swallow the light around it rather than reflect it, its edges constantly shifting as smaller pieces broke away and drifted independently before rejoining the main body. Sensors struggled to give it a fixed size or shape, because it never stopped changing. One moment it was long and narrow, cutting through space like a blade. The next, it had spread wide, sending out dozens of smaller offshoots that moved with their own eerie, coordinated purpose. "It's not a vehicle," Ithran said, watching the readings pour in. "Or it's not only a vehicle. Captain, I don't think there's a clean line here between what's the ship and what's the crew and what's the weapon. It's all the same thing. All of it, together." Colonel Chen's voice came through on the shared channel, calm but grave. "That matches what the old briefing said. The threshold isn't a fleet with a command structure you can break by killing the right target. It's closer to a single organism that happens to be spread across thousands of individual pieces. You can destroy parts of it, plenty of parts, and it barely notices. That's why conventional tactics failed the first time. We weren't fighting an enemy. We were fighting an ecosystem." "Then how do you fight something like that?" Ansel asked, unable to help herself even though the question wasn't really hers to ask. "You don't try to destroy all of it," Chen said. "You go for the parts that matter. Every organism has weak points, no matter how strange it looks from the outside. Our researchers found 3 of them, 60 years ago, at a terrible cost. We built this whole fleet around exploiting those 3 weaknesses. Whether it still has them after 60 years, we're about to find out." The fleet had spent the last 6 hours finishing its preparations, and Ansel had watched, awed, as 1,100 warships that had shown no sign of life 3 weeks earlier moved into a coordinated defensive formation with the smooth precision of a single machine. The outer rings spread wide, covering a vast area of space. The inner rings drew tighter around the central ship, the last word, which Ansel now understood was not simply the flagship but the actual heart of the entire operation, housing the majority of the surviving human crew and the command systems that tied the whole fleet together. "How many people are actually awake over there?" Ansel asked Ithran quietly, watching the life sign readings continue to stabilize across the fleet. "Best estimate, a few thousand," Ithran said. "Spread across 1,100 ships, most of them running on skeleton crews. Some ships showing only a handful of people, a few showing none at all, running fully automated. It's not enough people to crew a fleet this size under normal circumstances, but maybe that was the point. They didn't build these ships to need a full crew. They built them to run themselves, with just enough people awake to make the decisions the machines couldn't make on their own." Ansel thought about that for a long moment. A species that had lost a war so badly it chose to disappear rather than keep fighting in the open, had still found the discipline and the resources to build a fleet capable of running itself for 60 years, waiting patiently, in case the fight came again. It was not the story of a broken people. It was the story of a people who had refused to be broken, even after losing almost everything. The threshold closed the remaining distance faster than any of the fleet's sensors had predicted, and the battle began, without any clear moment of declaration. The way a storm begins not with a single crack of thunder, but with a slow, building pressure that suddenly breaks all at once. The outer ring of the human fleet opened fire first, weapons that had sat cold and silent for 60 years finally doing the job they had been built for. Beams of concentrated energy and streams of kinetic projectiles lanced out toward the approaching darkness, and Ansel watched, breath held, as they struck home. It did almost nothing. "They're hitting it," Ithran said, disbelief in his voice. "Direct hits, dozens of them, and it's barely slowing down." "That's expected." Chen's voice cut in, steady despite the chaos building around her ship. "Standard weapons aren't the point here. We're not trying to kill it with brute force. Watch the flanking squadrons." Ansel shifted her focus and saw what Chen meant. While the outer ring kept up its barrage, drawing the threshold's attention and absorbing its response, smaller, faster squadrons broke away from the main formation and swung wide, arcing around the edges of the dark mass with practiced coordination. Each of these smaller ships carried a different kind of weapon system, one Ansel didn't recognize from her earlier scans of the sleeping fleet, likely something kept dormant until this exact moment. When the flanking squadrons opened fire, the results were immediately different. Where the standard weapons had barely marked the threshold surface, these new strikes caused visible reactions, sections of the dark mass convulsing and pulling back, the constant shifting motion faltering for just a moment, before resuming. "That's it," Ansel breathed. "That's one of the weak points." "Confirmed," Chen said. Old data held up. It doesn't like directed resonance fields. Something about how its component pieces communicate with each other. Disrupt that communication in a concentrated area, and for a few seconds, that section can't coordinate with the rest of it. That's our opening. The battle unfolded over the following hours, in a way that reminded Ansel less of the chaotic warfare between other species she had witnessed, and more of something closer to a hunt, careful and calculated, each side testing and adapting to the other. The Threshold, for its part, did not fight the way any ordinary enemy would. It did not retreat when hurt, did not seem to feel fear or hesitation in any way Ansel could recognize. It simply kept moving forward, kept trying to reach the fleet's core, kept expanding and adapting as pieces of it were destroyed, growing new offshoots to replace whatever it lost. But the human fleet had spent 60 years and, before that, years of desperate and costly research preparing for exactly this fight. Every ship knew its role. The outer ring absorbed the brunt of the Threshold's advance, drawing its attention and its mass forward into a killing field the inner rings had carefully prepared. The flanking squadrons struck at the coordination weak point again and again, opening brief windows where sections of the Threshold lost the ability to act as one unified whole. And in those windows, a third group of ships, held in reserve until exactly the right moment, moved in. "What are those?" Ansel asked, watching a new set of vessels break from the inner formation, smaller than the warships, but bristling with equipment she didn't recognize. "Extraction ships," Chen said, and for the first time Ansel heard something like grim satisfaction in her voice. 60 years ago, we learned something else about the Threshold, something we never got the chance to use before the war ended in retreat rather than victory. Deep inside that mass, there's a core structure, something like a seed, that the rest of it grows from and stays connected to. Destroy enough of the outer body and disrupt the coordination fields long enough, and that core becomes exposed just long enough for a precision strike. We spent 60 years designing weapons specifically to find and hit that core the moment it's vulnerable. Ansel watched the extraction ships dive toward the writhing, shrinking mass of the Threshold, weaving between debris and defensive strikes with the kind of precision that only came from either extraordinary skill or extraordinarily thorough training, likely both. Deep inside the darkness, sensors began picking up something new, a small, dense structure buried at the heart of the Threshold's mass, glowing faintly, with an energy signature unlike anything else in the readings. "There," Ithrin said. "Captain, I see it too. That has to be the core." The extraction ships opened fire in a tightly coordinated burst, every shot aimed at that single small point deep within the enemy's shifting mass, and for a moment, everything seemed to hang suspended in the dark. Then the core structure flared bright, once, and the entire mass of the Threshold began to convulse and collapse inward, the constant shifting, growing motion that had defined it suddenly reversing, pieces of it going still and lifeless, drifting apart rather than merging together. A cheer went up across the fleet's shared communication channel, dozens of voices at once, some professional and disciplined, some raw with relief and disbelief, all of them human, all of them people who had slept for 60 years for exactly this chance and had just watched it pay off. Ansel found herself smiling despite everything, despite the fear of the last several hours, despite the strangeness of watching a battle she had no part in, and barely understood the stakes of only weeks earlier. "They did it," she said quietly. "They actually did it." "Don't celebrate yet." Chen's voice cut through the noise, and something in her tone made the cheering die down quickly across the channel. That was one Threshold formation, a relatively small one, based on the sensor data we've got, compared to what our records say we faced 60 years ago. If this one found us, it wasn't wandering by accident. Something either sent it, or it reported back before it engaged. Either way, we should assume more are coming, and probably sooner rather than later. The bridge of the quiet current fell quiet at that. Ansel looked at the wreckage of the defeated Threshold formation drifting in the dark, small and broken now, nothing like the looming, growing mass it had been only hours earlier. It had been beaten, decisively and completely, by a fleet that had spent 60 years asleep, preparing for exactly this moment. But Chen was right to be cautious. One battle won did not mean the war was over, and if the Threshold truly operated the way the old records suggested, spreading and growing and consuming everything in its path, then this small formation was likely nothing more than a single tendril of something far larger, still out there in the dark, still unaware, for now, of exactly what had just happened to the piece of it that had come looking. "Captain," Ithran said quietly, "what do we do now?" Ansel looked out at the fleet, at the 1,100 warships that had just proven, beyond any doubt, that humanity's 60 years of patient, careful preparation had not been wasted. She thought about the tired voice in that first recording, warning whoever found this fleet to be careful, to understand what they were dealing with. She thought about Colonel Chen's calm, steady voice through hours of desperate battle, never once wavering. "Now," Ansel said, "I think we help them get ready for whatever's coming next." In the days that followed the battle, the fleet did not rest. Ansel watched, from her careful distance, as the 1,100 warships settled into a new rhythm, no longer the frozen silence of 60 years of waiting, but the busy, disciplined activity of a military force, preparing for a war it now knew, with certainty, was not over. Repair crews moved between damaged hulls. Sensor arrays were recalibrated and expanded, scanning deeper into the dark beyond the system than they had in decades. And slowly, carefully, more of the fleet's dormant crew stations began to fill, as stasis pods across dozens of ships completed the long, careful process of waking their occupants. Colonel Mara Chen invited Ansel aboard the Last Word. 3 days after the battle, an invitation that Ansel accepted with a mixture of excitement and nerves she hadn't felt in years. The shuttle ride across the gap between her small survey ship and the enormous flagship gave her plenty of time to reflect on how strange her life had become in the span of a few short weeks. She had come to Sol System looking for old ruins to catalog. Instead, she had found the last living remnant of a species everyone believed extinct, awake and armed, and ready to keep fighting a war that had never truly ended. Chen met her personally at the airlock, a tall woman with gray threading through dark hair, her uniform simple and practical, her handshake firm. Up close, Ansel could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the particular tiredness of someone who had woken from 60 years of sleep, directly into the middle of a battle, and had not stopped working since. "Captain Voro," Chen said, "thank you for coming. And thank you, again, for the sensor data during the engagement. It made a real difference in how quickly we could adapt our tactics." "I didn't do much," Ansel said. "You and your people did all the fighting." "You stayed," Chen said simply. "Most wouldn't have. That counts for something." She gestured down the corridor. "Walk with me. There are things I think you deserve to understand, given everything you've already seen." They walked together through corridors that Ansel now recognized as similar in design to the smaller ship she had explored weeks earlier, though everything here was on a much grander scale. Crew moved past them with quick, purposeful steps, some pausing to offer Chen a nod or a quick word, before continuing on their way. The ship felt alive in a way it hadn't when Ansel first detected it from a distance, no longer a monument to a lost war, but an active, functioning military vessel, preparing for whatever came next. "You want to know what happened to the rest of us?" Chen said, not quite a question. "The part of the story the historians outside never got. I've read some of what other species believe happened to humanity. Most of it isn't wrong exactly, just incomplete. I'd like to understand," Ansel admitted. "If you're willing to share it." Chen led her into a quiet observation room near the center of the ship, a wide viewport looking out over the fleet, rows of warships visible against the stars, no longer silent and dark, but lit and active, small shuttlecraft moving between them like a slow, steady heartbeat. "When we realized we couldn't win the war the way we were fighting it," Chen said, "our leadership made a decision that split what remained of humanity into two groups. One group, the smaller of the two, volunteered to crew this fleet. We knew what we were signing up for. Extended stasis, an uncertain wait, possibly decades, possibly longer, for an enemy that might never come back, or might come back stronger than before. It wasn't an easy decision for any of us. Some of us left family behind in the other group." "And the other group?" "Scattered," Chen said. "Deliberately, carefully scattered, across dozens of systems, some already settled by other species who agreed to take in refugees, some entirely unclaimed and remote. Small groups, spread thin, given false histories in some cases, encouraged to blend in wherever they landed, rather than rebuild anything that looked like the civilization the Threshold had already found once. The idea was simple. If the Threshold ever came back looking for humanity specifically, it would find this fleet, and it would find a fight. It would not find easy, undefended targets scattered across 100 worlds. Ansel absorbed that in silence for a moment. So the silence wasn't humanity disappearing, she said slowly. It was humanity hiding, on purpose, all of you, scattered on purpose, so that no one, not even your own descendants in some cases, would know where to find each other, in case the Threshold ever tracked one group back to the rest. That's exactly right, Chen said. It was the hardest decision our leadership ever made, and I don't think a single person who was part of it walked away from that choice without losing something. Families split apart deliberately, on the chance that scattering everyone thin would keep the species alive, even if this fleet eventually failed. We've had no contact with any of those scattered groups in 60 years, by design. We don't know how many of them survived, or thrived, or were lost to other dangers entirely unrelated to the Threshold. That's part of what we have to figure out now that the fleet is finally awake again. You're going to look for them, Ansel said. We have to, Chen said. The whole plan only makes sense if, eventually, when the immediate danger is handled, this fleet reaches back out and brings everyone home, or at least back into contact with each other. We beat one small formation 3 days ago. That's not victory. That's just proof the plan we spent 60 years preparing actually works. Now we need to find out how big the real threat still is, deal with it properly, and then start the long, slow work of finding everyone we scattered, and letting them know it's safe to stop hiding. Ansel looked out at the fleet again, thinking about the sheer scale of what Chen was describing. Not just a battle fleet, but the last careful gamble of an entire species, built to buy time, to survive an encounter with something the rest of the galaxy had never even heard of, and then to slowly, patiently rebuild everything that had been scattered in the name of survival. What can I do to help? Ansel asked. Chen looked at her, something like genuine warmth breaking through the exhaustion on her face, for the first time since they had met. Vakari ships travel further and faster through this part of space than we currently can, at least until we finish bringing more of the fleet's long-range vessels back online. If you're willing, carrying word of what's happened here, quietly and carefully, to trading routes and outposts where some of our scattered people might have ended up, could make a real difference. We're not looking to announce ourselves to the whole galaxy just yet. We're looking for our own people first. I can do that, Ansel said, without hesitation. I think my whole crew would agree. Over the following weeks, before the quiet current finally departed Sol system to begin the long journey outward, Ansel watched the fleet continue its careful, steady transformation, from a sleeping relic into something functional and ready. More crew woke from stasis every day. Damaged ships were repaired. Long-range sensor drones were launched outward in every direction, searching for any further sign of the Threshold's presence, while other ships began the delicate, careful process of testing communication protocols meant to reach out, quietly, toward whatever remained of humanity's scattered survivors. On her last day in the system, Ansel stood once more in the observation room aboard the Last Word. Looking out at the fleet with Colonel Chen beside her, the formation had changed since her first sight of it weeks earlier. It no longer looked like a monument, frozen and waiting. It looked like exactly what it was, a fleet preparing for a long and difficult road ahead, uncertain of what it would find, but ready, finally, after 60 years, to move forward instead of simply waiting. Every ship in this fleet waited for the same enemy for 60 years, Ansel said quietly, half to herself. I keep thinking about that. How much patience that must have taken. How much faith that the wait would eventually mean something. It wasn't faith exactly, Chen said. It was preparation. We didn't know if the Threshold would ever come back. We didn't know if we'd be here to fight it if it did. But we decided a long time ago that giving up wasn't a decision we were willing to make. Even if the fight never came. Even if we slept here for 100 years, and never got the chance to prove any of it mattered. The waiting itself was the point, being ready, no matter how long it took. Ansel thought about the tired voice in that first recording she had heard, weeks ago now, warning whoever found this fleet to be careful, to understand what they were dealing with. She thought about the memorial wall aboard the Silent Hour. Names of the dead, carefully preserved, even as the living prepared to disappear into a sleep that might have lasted forever. She thought about the Watchman system, patiently checking, over and over, for 60 years, never giving up, never stopping, simply waiting, faithfully, for exactly this moment. "I think you were ready," Ansel said. "I think, whatever comes next, you've already proven that." Chen smiled, tired, but genuine, and looked back out at her fleet. Rows of warships that had slept in silence for 60 years, and had woken, finally, not broken, not defeated, but exactly as ready as the people who built them had always hoped they would be. "We'll find out soon enough," Chen said, "but for the first time in 60 years, I think we've got a real chance, and that's more than we had when we went to sleep." Beyond the viewport, the fleet held its formation against the stars, no longer waiting in silence, but moving, at last, toward whatever came next.